So we'll start with a prayer, and then I'll introduce Richard and over to him for the talk. So we just be quiet for a moment. God of the heavens and the earth, you call us to share in the care of your creation and to bring food and fruitfulness from field and farm. Hear our prayer for all who make their living on the land, and make us grateful for the work of their hands and for the generosity of your provision. We ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. Right, so I'm very pleased to introduce Richard Kipling to you all. He's the head of research at the Sustainable Food Trust, and he's going to lead our workshop tonight on organic farming. Richard joined the Sustainable Food Trust in 2021 to oversee research activities, including within the Global Farm Metric, which I hope you'll explain to us, Richard, and across a range of other projects and focus areas. Since 2011, his research has included applying quantitative and qualitative methodologies to problems as diverse as guillemot breeding productivity, the pollinating niches of buttercups, and research priorities for animal health modelling. His current focus is on implementing change to more sustainable grassland-based livestock farming. So, Richard, I'll hand over to you now, please, and invite you to start your talk. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. So I've been asked to talk to you today. Thank you very much for the invitation. To explore the ideas of regenerative and organic farming. What's the difference between the two? Does that really matter? And what I'm going to hope to do, if I can, yes, there we are, is to first kind of do a little bit of an introduction, looking at defining organic and regenerative farming. And then think about actually how different are they when we look into it, and then get into a bit of whether they can actually work in terms of making the change in agriculture that we need, and then say actually what is it that we need. If we're saying can they work, where are we trying to get to, and hopefully give some ideas about potential ways forward that we can take. So first of all, defining the two kind of ways of looking at the world that have arisen and the relationship between them. So just very quickly, the organic movement is something that we can basically say is the way that everyone farmed up until the Green Revolution, when people started using chemicals and fertilizers, more scientific methods to boost yields and feed a growing population. But as that happened, there was a revival of thinking about more traditional ways of doing things, and in particular Rudolf Steiner's term of biodynamic agriculture. And that, as well as having this approach of kind of a living ecosystem and working with nature, had a spiritual aspect and a way of looking at things. For example, the phrase "the farm as an organism," and humans as part of that system and part of that organism, working with it to produce what we need. So very different from the idea of production based on how many inputs we put into it, just focusing on one thing, the amount of production. And those organic kind of aims or goals as healthy people, ecosystems, healthy animals, so animal welfare, a big part of that, but also the kind of social aspects in terms of fairness, care between people, between the livelihoods of the people producing and the people consuming food. And obviously, as we're all, I'm sure you're all aware, today certifications required to call yourself an organic farmer and to market your goods as organic. And that's defined in terms of, in particular, avoiding things like inorganic fertilizers, things like chemicals, so pesticides and herbicides, genetically modified organisms, limited use of antibiotics, and focusing on high animal welfare. And it's something that's very much regulatory and standardized. So there's a legal definition of organic. There's inspection by certification bodies for you to keep up your organic status in relation to different crops, different products that you're putting out there. And one of the big kind of benefits for the farmer is that this system creates customer trust, that they know what they're getting when they're buying organic. They know what isn't being done and kind of what is being done, and that allows the farmer to gain a premium in what they're producing. But also looking towards the fact that there's also that kind of mindset and that way of looking at the world that came from biodynamic agriculture underneath it. Now, of course, one thing that's happened is as we go into kind of certification and regulation, is that can become the focus, and we can kind of start to slightly maybe put aside the philosophy underpinning it, and you can say, well, okay, if I grow without these things, I can make more of a profit, and that's enough. So there's that challenge about actually, if you're focusing on the practices and what farmers aren't doing, how much you're actually focusing on those kind of important underpinning things, and that the outcomes from the system. And I think one of the challenges for organic is it hasn't moved, particularly in this country, outside a relatively small niche in terms of production. And I'll just quickly look at what organic systems kind of look like, or some of the important aspects of them. So, as I'm sure you're aware, it's the organic systems are based on using what nature's providing, using those natural cycles, building up fertility and health in the soil, and using the land in a rotation, in the kind of classic case, to enable those processes and to work with what's going on. So in that rotation, if we start top right, you have 2 or 3 years of grass and clover, and that's to build up the fertility, fix nitrogen, build up the nutrients, and also break pest and disease and weed cycles from the previous crops that have been growing. Then we go around to a cycle where you grow something that's nutrient demanding, like wheat, which uses and makes use of those high levels of fertility that have just built up during the years of grass and clover, the years when you've had lay systems. And then bottom left, moving to beans. So beans or peas, nitrogen fixing species that again build up the nutrients in the soil, break those pest and disease cycles associated with the cereals, and then moving round to oats or other cereals like rye that grow well at the end of the rotation in the soil conditions that are there. And then you move back to actually having your grass and clover lays to again start to build up the fertility. And obviously an important part of that in some but not all organic systems is to use animal grazing to get products during those years, but also to get the nutrients in through the animal manure, and the animals are performing various ecosystem roles at the same time. So in some organic systems, they use composting, so actually collecting the materials, the crop residues and so on, composting those and using those to add nutrients back into the system and get that circularity. So there are different approaches whether you see us as part of that system. If we turn then to regenerative agriculture, it's something that started being mentioned in the 1980s by the Rodale Institute, and they were responding to the narrative of sustainability in agriculture and saying, well, actually, we want to do more than just sustain things. That's not ambitious enough. We want to actually talk about regeneration. Now, I'd argue that you could quite easily put into the language of, sustainability, that ambition. But you can see sometimes the rebranding is really important in order to get people to think a little bit differently about the topic. And it's something that they mentioned in the 80s, it kind of disappeared and then re-emerged again in the 2000s, focusing on ideas of rebuilding soils, restoring biodiversity and other ecosystem services, particularly looking at carbon sequestration and the ideas around obviously net zero and actually using farming systems to capture carbon, and focusing on those outcomes through a range of practices. And one of the aspects of it was a link back to Indigenous knowledge and the idea that many of the approaches associated with regenerative are things that Indigenous people are potentially still doing and would have done in the past. And practices that are, again, based on building soil fertility, working with nature and those cycles. And it's been something that's been quite difficult to pin down because it's kind of grown up, the term regenerative, and it's been used by lots of different people. And Schriefel et al. In 2020 reviewed 98 different papers and looking at definitions of regenerative agriculture to try and pick out of those some kind of consensus. And actually what they found that a lot of papers were different people kind of putting their case for what it should be. But they boiled it down to an approach to farming that uses soil conservation as the entry point to regenerate and contribute to multiple ecosystem services. And you can probably see there's a lot of similarities there with what we've just looked at with organics. So how different are these two? So if we start and look at the organic practices, I've mentioned this already, this starting point of actually saying we want to farm without using some of these things, without the artificial fertilizers, without the weed killers and the pesticides, without as many antibiotics, without genetic modification, and with high animal welfare standards. So it's kind of drawing lines around what we're able to do and what we should be doing. And that you could actually argue that when you look at the regen practices that are most often talked about, like minimal soil disturbance, physical or chemical, maintaining soil cover, promotion of biodiversity, integrating crops and animals, and those rotations I talked about before, living roots in the soil to fix carbon and to improve the soil structure. Actually, all those things are things that you really need to do if you're farming organically, because if you're farming organically, you say, I'm not going to do these things, then you need to be doing these regenerative practices, if you like. But the difference is that regen isn't starting off from the point of saying you're not going to use fertilizers or weed killers. It might be saying we're going to reduce them, but it doesn't tie you necessarily to saying there's definitely going to be none of them. So there's an idea that it actually gives a flexibility. And in one respect, you could say, well, actually, is that a way to avoid not using these inputs, if you like? Or is it something that's providing a positive journey that people can go on without thinking, I've got to go all out to meet these organic standards before I can start doing something? And it's an interesting conversation and discussion point, potentially for later, to say, is this regenerative approach actually offering a pathway and saying, moving towards where we want to be in terms of outcomes is more important than starting off by saying we're not going to do X, Y, and Z. But regenerative has a mindset associated with it, if you like. And again, I think you can pretty quickly see how that is very close to the kind of biodynamic ideas and the organic ideas, so that you have complex agri-ecosystems where you're working with nature, you're using natural processes, not inputs to produce. Humans are part of an evolving system that they're managing, and it's a process of change rather than just a single goal to become regenerative. It's an ongoing thing. You're adapting to the changing system and the cycles. Also that there are social goals, but remember in organic, we said, okay, fairness is actually part of that original organic thinking. But those social goals in terms of justice in the food system and a fair deal for people and access to high quality food are in there in the regenerative mindset. and an idea of engaging with the land. So you can see a lot of similarities. And when you come to look at the outcomes, these are the outcomes I talked about for organics. So healthy ecosystem, healthy people, healthy animals, fairness and care. We see it again when you look at the work on regenerative agriculture, so healthy ecosystems and soils, pretty much the same thing. And then there are some things that actually are slightly different, or perhaps we could say they're kind of a realization of the issues with the way things have been done over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So the first one of those is this idea of context-specific solutions and valuing the local knowledge of the farmer. And that's something that's come to the fore as, look, it's important that actually we focus on the outcomes that are coming out of the farm system, how the farm system is changing, in when we decide how to reward farmers, when we decide how to think about what they're doing, rather than focus on, have you followed particular organic practices or particular regenerative practices? And if you focus on the outcomes, then it means that farmers have more leeway to actually apply what works in their specific contexts and not apply things that might have unintended consequences in some contexts. And the second aspect that's come out, and partly come out of the ability to collect more evidence, the new technology that allows more, sensors on animals, that allows satellite mapping and so on, the new techniques that have evolved over the decades to actually look at those outcomes in verifiable, quantitative ways. So to measure soil organic matter, to measure biodiversity, social outcomes, and so on. There are limits to that, of course, but those areas are where we start to see a slightly different approach. So it's like more on the outcomes, less on defining the practices to start with, and more on actually saying, we're not going to greenwash by saying if we've ticked off these practices, we're fine, whether things are improving or not. We're actually going to make an attempt to look at the outcomes and whether they're improving. So where does that take us? Well, to quite a few challenges. So in relation to organics, I've just spoken about it. In relation to organics, in relation to a lot of agri-environment schemes that governments put together, they focus on practices, which makes it quite top-down. So in fact, the responsibility of the farmer for what happens starts to be eroded, the space for their local knowledge, because it's, well, you do this, this, and this, and then we'll pay you. And that can lead to not just things that are inappropriate or have unintended consequences, but things that farmers actually themselves knew were going to have potentially bad consequences, but they were getting paid to do them. So it becomes kind of a tick box, and we're uncertain at the end of the day whether the outcomes are getting better because we're focusing on the practices. So outcome, the regenerative approach, if you like, actually allows that space for farmers to find what works for them and what works for their system. The problem comes is that if you're kind of trying to reward people for that, maybe even to take measures against them and regulate them if they're doing things that you think are wrong or that are bringing negative outcomes, is that actually the outcomes on the farm are shaped by lots of things, potentially beyond the farmer's ability to do anything about it. So if there's a polluting land user or a farmer or an industry right next to them that's having negative effects on their biodiversity, things might have got worse for no fault of their own. But similarly, if the farm next to them is doing great things, they're doing all the wrong things, actually their biodiversity data might be improving because of kind of the leakage of biodiversity out of the other system into their system. Now, that leakage is obviously positive, but are we ending up rewarding people where they shouldn't be, but also punishing people and not rewarding them when actually they've been doing all the right things? So that's the challenge for outcomes-based approaches. And it means that where it's worked best, so the Burren in Ireland is a good example of outcomes, but where outcomes-based approaches have been tried, or results-based approaches to agri-environment schemes, they've actually had a lot of people on the ground advising the farmers, working with the farmers, so they can actually see what the farmers are doing. They can see the whole thing, and they're able to kind of be much more informed about whether how much the farmer's done to produce the outcomes that are there. So there are some challenges, and there are challenges also in the measurement, what we choose to measure, and I'll come to in a second, but where we're measuring. So if we're measuring just on farm and we're talking about, for example, greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration. So we could look on the farm and say, okay, well, this farm's great. Okay, we've doubled the biodiversity. We've got a huge amount more carbon saved in the system. So that's brilliant. That farm's doing really well. We're making the world a better place. Here's the rewards for that. The problem with that is that if that's been achieved by reducing production on the farm, that production, if demand for everything stays the same, needs to move somewhere else. So this is your idea of carbon leak. That actually, if we take a particular country like Wales and we wanted a quick way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, maybe half the number of sheep. Okay, great, you've met your inventory targets. But if demand has stayed the same, those sheep are then being produced somewhere else, that meat's being produced somewhere else, maybe in situations where they're producing it and creating more damage than if you'd left it where it was on the farm that is the focus. So there are challenges about how we look at the impacts on the farm and the extent to which we can realistically get an idea of what's happening off farm as a result. So there are challenges in that respect in terms of looking at outcomes. There's then when we look at investors and financing change and focusing on, are the outcomes changing? Is that people might take up either organic practices or say that they're willing to measure particular outcomes in order to get a return and a profit, which is fair enough. But it doesn't really necessarily engage people with the mindsets and those philosophies and thinking behind the two movements, if you like, or behind where those two movements started at least. So another question is, we can ask, does that really matter? If people are either doing the right things with organics or getting to the right outcomes with regenerative. And of course, we can also say in organics, talk and what is happening is moving towards outcomes as well. But if people don't have that mindset, and if people are still doing things because other people have told them to, is that where we want to be? Is that enough of a change? And if things go wrong with that model, is that going to hold? Are those regenerative and organic processes still going to be followed if maybe the investors move to something else or something else happens? So there are some challenges potentially there, which we can think about rather than me answering. And then does this outcomes focus really avoid greenwashing? So one of the big thing is, look, we're not just looking at practices, ticking the boxes and then saying we've ticked the boxes, we've stuck a label on it, give us your money, but it's greenwashing. You know that actually you've ticked the boxes, but people are just paying lip service to it. Saying, right, no, actually we're going to measure actually what's going on the farm. We're going to say, right, okay, how much soil organic matter has that changed? We're going to say, how's biodiversity changed? The issue is choosing those indicators. And there's a paper by McNeil, and I'll include references at the end, but they might need to be something we share because they're written very small, was looking at the process that the UN went through when they were looking at sustainability development goal indicators for sustainable agriculture, so kind of global goals for it. And they ended up with a kind of a compromise of saying the indicator is going to be the percentage of land that is under productive or sustainable systems. So completely fudging it because you've got productive, which could be intensive and sustainable. And what McNeil was saying was that because every form of measurement has uncertainty attached with it, if you're representing, a company that's to do with, fertilizer use or particular inputs or a particular approach to agriculture, you can actually, in effect, in any collaborative way of doing things, you can kind of veto a particular indicator because you've worked out that your system isn't going to be great in delivering that outcome, but actually be all for an indicator that your system does okay in. So you might not actually get to the best place you want to be. So actually you might end up with a sort of form of greenwashing, though in a kind of around the houses kind of way. So that's something interesting as well. So with these things, I'm not saying, outcomes is bad, practice is good. There's issues with both of them. And it's how do we find a way forward that actually starts to improve things in reality and avoid some of those issues. And I'll come back to that. But what the big thing, that the next thing to look into is regen or organic actually a realistic approach to feeding the growing world population, and to doing that in a sustainable or regenerative way, however, whichever set of words we want to use. And I'm going to talk about evidence that's related to organic and regenerative practice and to organic itself, because hopefully, as I've showed in the previous slides, there's a huge overlap in actually what they mean philosophically and what they mean in terms of what you need to do on the farm to achieve them. And it's more about the difference between them is more about the framing and how we measure it and kind of govern that process, and which process of change is going to be most successful. So can they work? And I want to start by saying, well, what are we aiming for? And there's potentially lots of things to aim for, but in terms of sustainability, I think there's some clear trade-offs, important things. Is firstly, for kind of human societies to be sustainable, we need to meet our needs for crops and livestock products. We can talk about needs versus wants, and we can talk about waste in that, but it's saying production is important. But we also need to meet the needs of future generations for crop and livestock products. And that depends on the farms themselves being in a good state. Because if they're not in a good state, are they going to be able to produce in the yields we need longer term? And thirdly, we need to reduce the negative impacts that are coming from the system, and the regenerative aspect actually move towards actively improving environment and society beyond the farm. So can we do it with the types of practice that we've just been talking about with regenerative and organic? And these data I'm showing you now are from a paper that basically looked at meta-analyses, so reviews of reviews, if you like, globally, and tried to draw out the key messages. And they also critiqued and said, actually, are these using particularly robust methodologies, or are some of these meta-analyses actually a bit shaky in terms of what they're doing? And these are actually what they came out with as some of the best meta-analyses that were out there. So it's kind of very broad brush. But if we look at, for example, no tillage, so this is the idea you don't disturb the soil, because disturbing the soil in particular leads to the release of soil carbon, so the release of and other greenhouse gases. So the idea is you leave the soil intact. That improves the structure, that allows you to build up that soil carbon. Does it work? Well, these meta reviews found out that, kind of surveying all the work that had been done on it up to the dates of their studies, obviously, they found between an 8 and 13% increase in soil organic carbon. If we look at cover crops, so this is the idea that you don't have gaps when the soil isn't covered by a crop, so it kind of does what it says on the tin. So you harvest your crop in the autumn, and either you've had another crop growing up through it that provides cover then on going through the winter, or you plant another crop immediately that provides that cover, maybe brings nitrogen into the soil as well, but importantly prevents the carbon escaping, prevents the soil being eroded. And there's actually better evidence and less variable evidence for that, of maybe 15 or 16% increase in soil organic carbon. And then if we look at organic amendments, so this is the idea, we talked about the lay period of the rotation, where you're building up the fertility of the land, your organic amendments like your compost, like your manure, things like biochar. And actually there's quite a lot of evidence at a global level that you can get quite big increases of soil organic carbon. We'll come back to some of the caveats around this afterwards. But for organic amendments without fertilizer, Chenatal was saying, it's up to 49% increases in some of the overviews. And if you add organic amendments plus, I think that should, if you add organic amendments, even if you're still using your kind of negative or inorganic fertilizer, if we're looking for an organic standard, you can still get increases of 29%. So it's like the organic amendment and stopping using the inorganic fertilizer gives you that bigger 49%. It's like the even better. And then biochar again versus no biochar leads to these increases of up to 28%. And overall, kind of looking at the systems, organic versus conventional, the meta-analysis of Garcia and Garcia Palacios et al. Was that you can get 27% increase in organic systems versus conventional. Now, there's lots of challenges. So the review methods, to get these really overarching figures, you're putting together the outcomes of lots of other individual studies. So you're kind of simplifying things. And there might be conditions in which particular no-till systems might not do so well and might actually lead in some circumstances to net emissions. It also depends on the starting point. So it's this idea of how long can sequestration go on. So sequestration is how much carbon can you add to the soil. Storage is how much is in it. Now, you can imagine if you've got a soil that hasn't been disturbed, maybe a peat soil that hasn't been disturbed for thousands of years, maybe, then you're going to have a lot of carbon in there, and you can't really do much to increase the amount of carbon in it. But if you go from an arable system that's been really kind of worked hard, has got very low levels of organic matter and carbon, you can quite easily build it up. So there's variations with starting point, and there's also variations with the conditions, the soil type, the climate conditions, the other things that are going on. And there's an issue that is starting to improve. People are starting to look at it, but there's an issue about soil depth that a lot of the studies to date, if you look at those soil depth indicators there's one which covered some studies that looked up to 100 centimetres, but a lot of them are looking at the topsoil. And in some cases, you can get kind of movement and interactions between the topsoil and lower levels that might mean you get more in the topsoil, but the lower levels are depleting, or vice versa. So actually, we need to know more about what's going on more deeply if we want to be more certain about these data. And we also have to think wider. So if we think about what's the difference between organic and regenerative, well, potentially in a regenerative system, if you weren't into the mindset of it, but you wanted to kind of follow the thing and increase your carbon in your land, is you could say, right, I'm going to not do till, and not till the soil, not turn the soil. Okay, but if I don't till the soil, then I get a lot of weed buildup. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray it off with Roundup and, probably do terrible things in terms of biodiversity, but I'm not tilling and I'm building up my soil carbon. So that's the challenge of, if you don't have those organic standards of practice, there might be ways to undertake these different kind of methods and to achieve outcomes that maybe do things that have other impacts that we might not like. On the other side, when we're actually doing things like cover crops, there can be lots of other benefits, like for wildlife, for example, and the positivity of circularity with organic amendments, that you're not getting waste coming out of the system that you might have in a more intensified system like we have now, that the waste, say the manure from the animals, is turned into slurry in one area of the country or even the world. But the arable systems that could be used to fertilize are somewhere completely different, and therefore you can't link them up, and you have pollution in one place and inorganic fertilizers in another. So anyway, let's look at organic rotations. I probably need to speed up a little bit because I'm probably going to end up talking over time. But some things have been looked at in rotations in general. So adding legumes to crop rotations, which can fix nitrogen. For Wales, it's been shown, some work that I was involved with in 2017 and some work earlier, that actually that can have an effect in increasing soil carbon by using a rotational approach with the legumes. And that was backed up by research in 2023. So a particular study where they're looking at comparing intensive cereal rotation with diversified organic rotations, like the ones I looked at with the grass and clover lay, and actually what the difference is between different fertilization. And previous to what I said on the, similar to what I said on the previous slide, combining a diversified organic rotation with a 3-year lay plus compost fertilization rather than mineral actually delivered stable soil carbon sequestration. So the compost fertilizer increased the topsoil carbon stocks and stabilized it. With the rotation alone and the lay alone, you got the stable carbon stock lower down, but maybe not in the upper layer. So putting those things together. So this idea of actually the organic approach taken as a whole can be really, that's how you get the benefits rather than just plucking out one or two things that you do. But there's a counter argument which is put by from LCA studies that actually show when you look at organic versus conventional systems, actually maybe organic don't always come out better. So in this case, in this analysis of looking at the response ratio, anything above 1 is that the organic systems are having bigger negative effects, and that below 1 is that they're having bigger, smaller negative effects. And what they show is that from these studies, energy use is lower for organic systems, which you would expect with the fewer inputs, but actually the kind of escape of nutrients, acidification isn't better, and sometimes it's worse, although the bars around the dots, so the lines around these dots are like the level of uncertainty. So if the uncertainty goes across that horizontal line at 1, then actually there's not a statistical difference, if you like. So it's just a trend. But you see, for land use, particularly, organic comes out worse from these types of study. And this is the issue of yield and the yield gap. And the writers of this paper and the article that drew these results together are very much saying, look, energy use isn't actually the big area that farming's having an impact. It's land use. Organic is worse in land use, and actually that's the most important thing. There's not maybe too much difference with the other things. So that's quite a negative view of organics. And this global use of land for food production kind of shows that how important agriculture is as a land user. 45% of land use for agriculture. And the argument from that is it's actually what you eat. Focus on the fact that your meat production is using a lot more land and resources rather than eating vegetables or fruit, for example, not whether it's the organic or conventional system. So what's the counter argument to that? Well, one of the counter arguments is that actually one of the things that I'll just flip back to this, one of the things that this doesn't look at is biodiversity, which is obviously hugely important because we're facing a biodiversity crisis and all the ecosystem services that are put at risk by that. That's not in these studies. There are also various assumptions and generalizations behind life cycle assessments, which you could do about whether these are actually figures that are particularly meaningful in particular cases. So there's a lot of uncertainty about this, of whether this is really the case. But let's focus on biodiversity for a short while. So we've looked at the greenhouse gas emissions and the sequestration. And what we know is that actually, having systems that are mainly conventional, if we look at biodiversity and how it's changed, actually the biggest change is in farmland birds. So these more intensive systems that we're saying, are they using less land so that it's less impacts? Actually, the biodiversity on them is actually going down the most. In the UK, different countries in different places in terms of development and so on may be different. And there's this, and one of the mechanisms of this is that biodiversity is related to the the heterogeneity, if you like, of the landscape. So, and this particular paper, Priya et al., was looking at biodiversity in terms of configurational heterogeneity, which sounds really complex, which is basically looking at how many different, if I get this the right way around, sorry, compositional heterogeneity, which is looking at how many different components there are. So the bottom one, there's only one type of land use, then there's two, and then there's four at the top. And then configurational is kind of what pattern that land use is in. And the expectation is that there'll be positive relationships between biodiversity and the complementary resources that you get from having more compositional heterogeneity, so more different types of stuff, and from having connectivity, so the pattern of those. And they looked across various different species groups. I've just picked out pollinators. The stars show positive, statistically significant positive response in terms of richness, a diversity indicator, and the abundance of pollinators in the landscape. So as you get more heterogeneous, more complexity, and more connectivity, you're getting benefits for pollinators, but they also found for mammals as well, for other insects, for birds. And that's vital because the connection with that and organic systems or regenerative systems is that you're using more rotations. So you're bringing a lot of diversity into the environment, into the actual productive environment, but also by not using some of the inputs, you're increasing the biodiversity outside it. And if we see what conventional kind of specialization has done, this is from a project, a mixed farming project in West Wales, a landscape around the Aberystwyth University, the kind of countryside campus, in 1830, where you can see the brown areas of arable really breaking up those areas of pasture and woodland as well. And then what we see today, which is mostly completely pasture, not great for the biodiversity when we know about that link shown on the previous slide. And as you would kind of expect from that, a review of a lot of studies of 98 studies in this case showed, in fact, I'm not sure if that figure's right, but the number of comparisons that Stein and Backing looked at across the different studies, yes, they were 98 review studies, that's why those numbers are different, showed that they looked at 47, organic versus conventional. Organic did better in relation to either species richness or abundance in 58% of the time, no difference 38%, worse only in 4%. And they found these quite high figures in terms of the average number of plant species, of species richness and abundance of birds, and similar for insects. So that connection we'd expect with the organic system actually is borne out in practice. And their results were quite conservative, if you like, because they were looking at systems that were actually kind of legally organic, if you like. So there were some systems they were looking at that were very similar, but couldn't be called organic because maybe they did one or two of the practices that couldn't count. So actually, that showing this difference between them is quite impressive. And the second aspect of this is there's using the land and using the land. So if an organic system uses the land, but it looks like the picture on the left there, it's a diverse wildflower meadow that might be more diverse in terms of biodiversity than what would be there if those animals weren't there and that system wasn't there, versus using less land, but like in the bottom right, where there's really nothing else going on in terms of value to anyone else from that land. So there's an argument that actually land use isn't really quite fair to say an organic acre is the same as an intensive acre, and actually that means that the land use argument starts to break down a bit. I'm going to rip through this a bit because I'm realizing that I've probably talked for a lot longer than I should have done, so apologies for that, but it's one of these topics you get into just looking at the yield gaps, and I think this is really important, and maybe we can stop after this and I'll skip some of the rest of it, as I always get over enthusiastic and throw lots of stuff in, which is great for the story, but only if you've got 3 hours to spare in your lives. So there was a paper looking at the yield gap, and again, looking at reviewing papers that were out there and kind of looking at the big overarching analysis that came out of it. And what they showed was actually for different types of crops, there's quite huge variation in the yield gap between organic and conventional. So if we look at cereals, for example, the range is from no yield gap in some studies to minus 84% in other studies. For things like legumes, you can go from a minus 18% to actually a big increase in yield. So actually, with that variation, there's an argument for saying the answer isn't to intensify by adding inputs to systems that have been organically farmed before to increase the yield, but actually to do organic better and to do regenerative better in those systems, to move to the right, if you like, of that picture there, and actually get to a place where you're getting all the benefits from organic without as many of this negative in terms of the loss of yield. There's an idea also that organic landscapes, so not just one farm, but whole landscapes, you get kind of reinforcement of the positive effects of those, again, could help to boost yields. And actually, the SFT suggested in a recent report that you could probably factor in a 20% yield increase if research starts focusing on increasing yield in organic systems through breeding and so forth, rather than in breeding crops and livestock that increase their yield if you put lots of inputs into them. So actually there's an issue with inputs. And the final big point is we can say, oh, these systems are using less land and producing more for us, these conventional systems, let's keep doing it. Well, actually, we know that ecosystems have tipping points, Dust Bowl in America, Grand Banks fisheries, we can go on. And we know systems are getting closer to their tipping points. If you push something in one direction, eventually you'll get to one. We don't really know where they are. There's all sorts of figures about how many harvests we've got left. No one really knows, but it's a kind of game of roulette. If we keep intensifying, how long till those bits of land fall over? And then you do have to go into the extra land that you said you spared before. So there's lots of issues. So again, laying out the argument rather than dictating to you. I think what is needed, I think maybe we can leave to another day because I've talked for so long, and open it up for discussion. There's lots in that second part, and there's lots of other stuff I'd love to talk to you about. But looking at my watch, I think that's probably enough, and hopefully something that can start some interesting debate. So if I stop sharing now, and I can finish off kind of bits of the story ad hoc if you want, but hopefully that was of interest and maybe stimulating some thoughts about it, about the topic.
That was superb, Richard. Thank you so much. When we started our LOAF principles way back 25 years or so ago, the only game in town was organic. And, these other regenerative in particular has come very much into the picture recently. So it's been super to get a bit of a comparison and an explanation of differences and similarities between them. Now, there are loads of questions in the chat. If anybody just wants to stick their hand up, you know where to find the reaction button to put your hand up, and then we'll see you at the top. Right, let's make a start with Kat. You had a question beginning there. Come in while I'm finding where we are.
I did. May I?
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm really interested in this this challenge between organic and regenerative farming. And when I was kind of growing up into permaculture, the phrase that was used was that organic was about having low or no impact, and that regenerative was about having a positive impact. And I remember a fellow Christian saying to me, what an unambitious target to have no impact when we're in God's image. Yeah. And I'm just wondering whether you have a perspective on that as a Christian, as well as a farmer and a researcher.
Yeah, I would say, kind of going back to those kind of roots of organic, when you look all the way back, I suspect that at the beginning of it, people wouldn't have thought of it in terms of no impact. And maybe because, obviously part of the reason for organic pushing was against something and saying, look at the huge impact we're having. So it's like a step. So I would say that probably organic is more ambitious than that, and actually has more ambitious outcomes than that. But maybe regenerative is useful in terms of just reaffirming that and saying something that maybe sounds more dynamic. So maybe there is like a semantic thing in it that actually is useful, even though we say actually under the surface, the organic people, the people that are really, have that mindset, do want to make things better. And definitely I'd agree as a Christian and everyone else, that's what we should be aiming for. So it's almost about messaging and about, I suppose, the organic thing of saying we want to minimize impact is saying the route to change is to get people to think, okay, how can I reduce the harm I'm doing? And that's seems doable to them. Whereas the regenerative thing is saying, well, don't worry about stopping doing all these things like fertilizers and chemicals all at once, because that doesn't seem doable. Take some steps towards doing it. So in both cases, it's like trying to find ways to be not less ambitious, but set up a journey. But then the question is, if people are coming into it with different motives, do you get the journey, or do you end up just at the lowest rung of the journey, if you like? So
yeah.
Thanks very much.
I get that. Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart Keane, if you'd like to unmute yourself and perhaps ask us your first question there.
Yeah, no, sure. No, thanks very much. And thanks, Richard. Yeah. I mean, I've had an interest in farming systems for many decades. But I'm particularly interested in what incentives you think work best to encourage farmers in UK, and then I've said globally, but I'm really thinking sort of small scale farmers in, for example, Zambia, which I'm familiar with. What do you think would be required to encourage them to adopt a regenerative organic farming practices?
Yeah, and this basically, Stuart, was what would have probably turned out to be the second hour of the talk, if I'd gone into that. So let's see if I can sum that up in a particular way. So I think the first thing to do if we look at incentives is actually, first of all, you have to start off with what's stopping people from doing it. Because if you're still talking about incentives, what you're saying is you're in a position where you don't want to do that. So how can we get you to do it? Whereas actually, if there's a challenge, that they might want to do it, but not be able to for some other reasons. So one of the big things about the global farm metric, again, look, I've put all these exciting things in the second half of the talk, is that it's saying actually the farm's an open system. There's this context. There's all these pressures on the farmer from outside. They're creating barriers. They're creating challenges. And the farmers are under pressure in terms of their own businesses. So you can divide it up into four types of challenge. Is practical challenges, including monetary challenges. Can I afford to make the transition? Can I afford to change things? But also, how's my system set up? Is it actually, how physically difficult is it to do it? If I'm an intensive system with all barns, how do I turn into a pasture system? Those kind of things. So there's the practical side. There's the knowledge side, is do I know what to do? And even if I know what to do the things, do I know the detail of what that's going to do if I do it? I'll put that in a really poor way, but you know what I mean. And then the interests and motivations of the farmer is what do you want out of it? What position are you in? What motivation are you forced to following? So if you can only make money by intensifying because of the state of the market, you're kind of trapped and you're motivated to say, well, actually, my first priority is looking after my family, and I can't look any further because the system won't allow me to do it. And I think, and the last one is cognitive. And when I put this at the university, I said, are you saying that farmers are thick? And I was saying, no, what I mean is farmers are dealing with a massively complicated system, complex system, not uncomplicated, massively complicated wants and pressures from different parts of society. And then people come into them and say, oh, also, will you just do this? And will you just do that? And there's a limit to what any human mind can process. And every, researchers are cognitively limited, every human being is, so it's not negative to farmers, but it's saying actually throwing a load of information or throwing a load of money, if you're not actually supporting that more holistic way of thinking, might not actually drive change if that's the issue. And that's one of the reasons for having a framework to look at sustainability holistically, to help people to do that thinking, whether they're a farmer or whether they're a policy maker, more joined up policy and so on. Then if you go from challenges to solutions, incentives or regulation is one type of solution, which I'd call actually probably a controlling solution, because it's saying, I'm not going to change your mind, I'm not going to change the situation, but I'm going to give you some money or something else that makes you do it anyway. So it's not really solving the problem. It's kind of, it might be solving the outcomes, but it's not solving a lot of things under the surface. Doesn't mean it doesn't have a place, and it doesn't mean that it might not be the pragmatic way to do things, but it might not be effective if that monetary issue wasn't what was stopping it. And then you can have more empowering solutions, which are more about getting people to understand sustainability more holistically, to link up what people want from farms to actually the long-term interest of the farm continuing to exist, which is in the interest of the farmer and everyone else, and using that as a point for people to start working together to say, how can we get more sustainable systems? How can we get the rewards into those systems to support everyone along it and give access? And that probably is where we might need to look more to the developing world and approaches that are much more along those lines and much more along like kind of whole systems change and whole systems like community action and stuff. Whereas in the West, we're kind of much more used to these top-down, do what you're told and make it happen things, which has lots of issues off the side. Not quite sure I've nailed your point there, but I feel like your point probably needs another presentation. At risk of giving myself another job, but I mean, it's all there in the second half.
No, thanks so much, Richard. I mean, it's a huge area, and how you that process of change within I was working with an agricultural research system and an extension system, and changing mindsets to systems perspectives against disciplinary minded scientists, all very interesting and complicated. But anyway, I won't take more time as we don't have much, but that whole process of change is a fascinating one, and yeah, worthy of further consideration. But thank you.
Yeah, and I think it goes to the heart of it, the process of change, and like we were saying, it's almost like the new language that, you know, from organic to regenerative is almost an admission that the process of change hasn't happened, and what can we do to kind of kickstart it? And so it's people looking for those solutions, and it's like the actual farming solutions are probably there, and it's the systemic challenges and issues and the shape of the system that's preventing that change, perhaps. And one thing I was going to say at the end, and I will mention it because it's something that's quite important, I think, to mention, because I got the information off the people, is actually making change in our communities and getting involved in food supply and growing. I'm sure a lot of you are already, and I know you the LOAF approach and everything, you know, you're well aware of this, but I just think there's huge value of community action like that, starting to change mindsets from the bottom up, and maybe some of the minds in the community that you're changing go on to be people that are policymakers and are involved in making the decisions that could shape the system generally. So, you know, what can we do at that small level? And by forming those networks of individuals and networks of communities, you know, as we have in the church, what can we do through that? And the example I wanted to share was the Ladder to Sea gardening, community garden growing scheme in Aberystwyth at the Welsh Martyrs Church there, led by a guy called Nick Howells, great guy, getting people on board, really getting the parish involved with it, you know, supplying food to food banks, supplying, you know, having community events on there, having different people working on the land from the community, and actually making that change on the ground and showing people what food's about, and maybe starting to think about food more as a right than a commodity, and something that's part of us, you know, values the community. And it was, at the risk of going on slightly again, I found a course online that was looking at religion and ecology, and religion and some of the, you know, the climate and the food the various crises that we're having. and basically saying that at the heart of religion is that kind of ecological motivation, and kind of bread and wine at the center of things, all the symbolism, all the links up to creation. I'm literally talking to the converted. I know, but I think it's important in the conversations where it's like, oh well, this is the science and this is the research and these are the big things we need farmers to do, is about communities and us all doing it, but also recognizing that some of its systems change that we actually need to fight for as communities, and that's the challenging bit. How do you turn those small community efforts that are so valuable into actually people thinking differently across the systems? How do you encourage that? And that's some of the ideas I try and think about, and maybe some of you are as well. So anyway, sorry, I'm going on.
That's okay, Richard. Thank you. Jeannie, I'm going to ask Jeannie Daly to come in because we've been talking about the new systems coming in, but people who are keen and interested like ourselves, but the people are just starting to get interested. Jeannie has a question here. I think they'll be relevant to that. Jeannie? Hi.
Yeah. I was thinking about how under organic certification, if as a consumer, if I go to the supermarket or my local health food store or wherever, and I buy organic, I know that hasn't used any pesticides. It will be protecting biodiversity. It will have the highest standards of animal welfare. And I can buy that premium product, admittedly, but I can buy that product with confidence, which means that I know that as a consumer, I'm doing my bit to support farmers who are doing the right thing. Whereas with regenerative, because nobody can even agree really on a tight definition, I can't go to any old shop and buy something that's regenerative because it doesn't mean anything. And even if I go to the local farmers market and talk to the stallholder and they say, oh, yes, we're regenerative, but one person's idea of regenerative, unless I'm prepared to stand there for 3 hours and interrogate them and probably do my own farm audit, I'm not actually going to have any idea how the cows that produced the milk for the cheese were treated, and I lack that accountability. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think my thoughts are that I agree, and I think it's one of these that it's like the regenerative organic thing. It's like the regenerative is solving one problem and creating another one. So their argument would be to that is like, no, we're preventing greenwashing because people are just ticking the box of the practices, but actually lots of other stuff's going on that isn't great, and actually things aren't getting better. I mean, I can see you nodding. You obviously, I'm sure you know that the arguments very well. I think there is a case of saying, look, you do need some hard lines in there, because those hard lines are where you start. Actually, the hard lines aren't necessarily all this telling people exactly what to do and not allowing them to use their local knowledge and everything. All they're doing is saying these are the boundaries within which you use it. And actually, I think that's one of the big things. It's like, if you want to spur innovation, you tell people what they can't do. And then they're like, well, how do I get to where I want to be if I can't do those things? And then you get things changing. So I think there's definitely a role for those organic rules to be put in place, and then it's that question of pathways. We might say that's really important, but then people say, yeah, but that means that no farmers are going to do it because they don't know how to get to that point in that leap. Though it's an interesting problem, but I think throwing one thing out in favor of the other isn't right. It's going to have to be a mixture of all of those things. And the problem is that, like I say, saying, oh, we're going to focus on outcomes, so it's all fine. Look, you can measure what's happened, and what it is those measurements aren't necessarily accurate, and they might be focused on particular things you can do while still carrying on business as usual, and some other things might be going to pot. So it's almost more important what the mindset is behind it and the philosophy. If you've got the right mindset and philosophy, you're going to do the right thing, whether you're being judged on your outcomes or on your practices. If you've got the wrong mindset or philosophy, you're going to do the wrong thing. by either not engaging with organic, or by finding a way to get the outcomes by doing what you want. So it's got to be mindset and philosophy, I think. But the pragmatic real world thing means that there's always going to be these other things. So how can we help them to be, can we enable them to develop in a way that doesn't actually cause harm? I mean, that's going back to that, how ambitious are you, isn't it? But actually, can we get them to do the positive bits, but actually prevent them going down those roads that we can see could be problematic? Like, okay, I'm doing no-till, but I'm sticking Roundup on everything to suppress the weeds. So I'm doing regenerative. That's not what we want. Obviously,
is there a place for kind of a stepped pathway into increasingly regenerative, for example? Because organic's very binary. You are or you aren't, and it takes you several years to get there. Whereas with regenerative, is there more room to say, 5 years of regenerative farmer, and you have to show year-on-year improvements?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's what they'd say they're creating, is that pathway of we'll move towards it as the evidence builds up of what we can do to improve things, and with the pragmatism of actually meeting demand for food. The challenge is whether it is a pathway, or whether it just stops at the first rung and they say, oh, now everyone's regenerative, which again, very well. So like you say, one thing is, okay, if the argument is a pathway, how do we keep pushing people along it rather than stopping that pathway at the point where everyone's got a nice label on everything and we can all just buy it with a clear conscience because it says regen, where actually it's not too different from what it was before.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Jenny. Tim, did you want to come in with a question on the producers' side of things?
I had a question which is more about scale. I just wondered if you could give us a feel, Richard, for where these two markets are going at the moment. From what I can tell, organic grew quite rapidly, then sort of flat lines of it. I don't know whether it's increased or reduced at the moment. Regen, I've seen a couple of products on Waitrose with Regen on the marketing, but not a lot. So where are the two markets going at the moment?
I think the thing with organic is, so in the UK at least, it kind of rises and falls with conditions, if you like, with the economic conditions, what people are willing to pay for in supermarkets, also with things like the prices of inputs. And I was looking at some quotes and articles about the case for organic from the 70s, and they're saying, look, input prices are going up, this is the time for organic. We can see some of that, but obviously alongside the cost of living, means people can't actually afford it. And if I go into the supermarkets where I am at the moment, you struggle to find anything organic. And if you do find something organic, it's probably from Argentina or somewhere like that. Argentina's great, but maybe I don't want my apples from there when I live in Herefordshire. So anyway, there's lots to unpack in that. So I think one thing is that in Europe, the kind of farm to fork initiative that the European Commission has got in it, this kind of 25%, I think it's 25% organic by now testing. So I think I don't remember if it's 2030 or 2050, apologies. But the important thing is that in Europe, they're looking at building up that percentage of the land that's devoted to organic. So in those terms, in Europe, probably on the rise through that policy direction. I think in terms of investment and supply chain getting involved, then Regen is really being driven by that kind of thinking, is that they say, right, okay, well, let's measure how things are improving. And if we can get money in from investors in relation to that, so for example, via carbon credits or maybe by biodiversity credits, we can actually invest in helping farms switch to more regenerative processes without going, without it being as a hard line as we just talked about of going also to organic, because they'd argue that you need to do it incrementally and keep the supplies that they need. Now, there might be lots under the surface that we might question about, investors. Okay, that sounds really good, but investors want something out of the system as well, and it's not like the system's flush with lots of money to start with. You know, where's the payback coming? I think there's a potential with it, with carbon sequestration and stuff, to actually end up with transferring all the burdens onto farmers as landowners and leaving them unable almost to farm because they're holding all the carbon while we're still producing all the fossil fuel carbon, which is the real problem. Again, lots in that. So I think regen has the potential that could be exciting to get private money and to get the supply chain into actually paying attention to making improvements to food supply and everything. But it comes with that caveat, pinch of salt, whatever you want to call it, of just being critical and keeping an eye on. Some of the motivations might be in there, but maybe not even the motivations, because there are really good people that we work with as at SFT that do want to make a positive difference in big investment things in the supermarkets. But it's actually whether those market-based solutions and that market-based imperative at the base of it all can really be aligned with those mindsets and philosophies of organic and regenerative as it was kind of originally conceived. So yeah. I think, you know, public focus at Europe, organic on the increase, regen, probably the next big thing, but let's be careful that it goes in the right direction and think critically about whether it, you know, the extent it can.
That's a good point on which to end, Richard. We're going to have to call it to an end. We could go on forever, but thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating talk, really detailed and yet really, really informative. We're very, very grateful to you for coming and giving us the time here. Sort of virtual clap from everybody. Thank you so much. And we're going
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me as well.
I don't know whether you'd be willing just to stay on for a minute or two afterwards in case anybody has got a burning question. We will finish though on the dot of 1:15. So I'm just going to say to everybody, our next and the final one in this series of food workshops will be the first Wednesday in August, which is the 7th of August. And it's going to be on fair trade, which is the last letter of our LOAF principles, fair trade. It's Sarah Brazier, who's head of campaigns at the Fair Trade Foundation. So we'll hope to see you there, but we'll just finish, if we may please, with a brief prayer. So a spot of silence, and we bless to us, O God, the sun that shines above us, the rain that falls upon us, the earth that sustains us, the air that surrounds us, and the love that binds us together. Amen.